Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. I welcome you here, all representatives of mass media here at Multimedia Press Center of the international news agency Россия Сегодня. And it's my pleasure today to welcome our guests here in Moscow and in London. We open our video bridge within which we will discuss the current state of Russian-British relations, and we will cover a number of issues of internal European and international agendas that definitely affect Russia's interests and interests of Great Britain. And the reason why we have this expert communication is a planned visit for the end of this week. The head of Foreign Minister Boris Johnson, who that was postponed more than once, and now just on the eve of that visit, Mr. Johnson, together with Prime Minister Theresa May, allowed himself to say just a very strange comparison about speaking about Russia. Theresa May said that Russia is threatening the international order in which we all depend, and Mr. Johnson compared Russia with unfriendly Sparta. Very strange comparison on the eve of his visit to Russia, and I apologize for the delay of our video bridge because our guest in Moscow was in traffic jam because we don't have the best possible weather here, and all cars got stuck here in Moscow in endless traffic jams. Here today we have the senior lecturer on European law of Moscow State University of International Relations under the Russian Foreign Ministry, Mr. Topornin, and in London it's my pleasure to welcome member of UK Independence Party, Elizabeth Jones. Thank you for joining us today, and I welcome the second participant of our conversation, editor-in-chief of the Politics-in-Chief magazine, Marcus Papadopoulos. Thank you very much for joining us today as well. So I suggest that we should start our discussion with this forthcoming visit of Mr. Johnson's visit to Moscow. So I suggest that our British experts open our conversation today and comment on Boris Johnson's comment on Russia and in his recent interview to Sunday Times. And also I suggest that you should answer the question from your point of view, or is there a potential for Russia and the UK to improve their relations, and why Mr. Johnson is coming to Moscow? What is he ready to suggest for normalizing Russian-British relations? Give the floor to you, Elizabeth. Let us start with you.
Good morning. Thank you very much for hosting me. I think that we've got a very, very good chance for improving British-Anglo relations with Russia, an outstanding opportunity. Please don't pay much heed to what Boris Johnson has said. He is quite an excellent PR person. He certainly knows how to generate a lot of interest, whether that's positive or negative. He can certainly generate a lot of noise, and we're all talking about him today. So he has achieved his aim of heightening interest in the Anglo-Russian connection. Now, it's a very, very, very long relationship between Britain and Russia. It started about 1553 with Mary I and Ivan the Terrible. Indeed, Ivan the Terrible, I understand, wanted to have Elizabeth I's hand in marriage. And indeed, our royal family is genetically connected to Russia, with George V and Tsar Nicholas II being first cousins. You can't sweep this away, no matter what some PR buffoon says. This cannot be swept away. We have very, very strong trade links. We have a significant trade trade deficit with Russia. I know that we've imported a great deal of oil, minerals from Russia, and indeed Russia buys from us a lot of cars, agriculture, arts, financial services, educational services. We have a very, very, very strong connection, and I hope that this will be strengthened, and we're here talking about it today, so I'm extremely positive.
Marcus.
Marcus, a similar question is addressed to you. From your point of view, what Mr. Johnson will bring to Moscow, what will he suggest to improve our relationship?
Well, I welcome Mr. Johnson's visit to Moscow. I encourage dialogue, I encourage communication between Britain and Russia. At the end of the day, there is nothing to lose for either party by entering into dialogue with one another. However, that said, whilst there may be some progress made between Britain and Russia in terms of trade, in terms of investment, if we're talking about bilateral relations, well, there will be no improvement whatsoever. And there are a number of reasons for that. Firstly, historically speaking, Britain and Russia are adversaries. They are rivals. There is mutual bitterness, there is mutual suspicion between the two countries. They have never gotten along with each other, and they will never get along with each other. Let's not forget they fought a war with one another, the Crimean War. Let's not forget that Britain invaded Russia, along with the Americans, along with the French, along with the Czechoslovakians and the Japanese during the Russian Civil War. And let us not forget as well that Britain has, even up until the present, has posed a very, very dangerous threat on the international scene to Russia. The sanctions that the European Union placed on Russia back in 2014 were ultimately as a result of Britain putting pressure on the Germans and the French. The Germans and the French were very hesitant to place sanctions on Russia, but because Britain is effectively a vassal state of the Americans, they were lobbying hard for those EU sanctions. So there will be no improvement. And anyone who is familiar with the history of Anglo-Russian relations will understand that what's happening at the moment is not unusual. If we're talking about Britain's attitude towards Russia, Britain has always had a very, very condescending, a very aggressive, a very hostile approach towards Russia. And what we see at the moment has happened throughout the hundreds of years of relations between London and Moscow. Now, if we take Boris Johnson, Boris Johnson is an archetypal member of the British establishment. And remember, the two elements of the British establishment, the two core elements of the British establishment are, of course, the monarchy and the aristocracy. And Mr. Johnson is from the latter, from the aristocracy. So his interview to the Sunday Times, where he referred to ancient Greece, no one should be surprised by that, because Mr. Johnson is a product of his upbringing. The British aristocracy very much regards the world as being polarized between East and West. And through their public schooling, people like Mr. Johnson are very, very reliant on the works from ancient Greece and ancient Rome, whereby they believed that to the east in the world there is barbarism, to the west of the world there is civilization, there is democracy, and there is freedom. And that is very, very much how Mr. Johnson and the rest of the British establishment regard Russia. Indeed, they also regard countries like China as well. The other point I should make as well, why there won't be an improvement in relations between Russia and Britain just because of Mr. Johnson's visit, is that effectively Britain does not have an independent foreign policy. And people in Moscow understand that. People in Moscow understand that relations with Russia relations with Britain are of a secondary importance. British foreign policy is effectively made in Washington, and Britain has a special relationship with America. It does lobbying on the global scene on behalf of America. It does America's bidding, and no way will Britain develop an even more conciliatory approach towards Russia. America and Britain are fierce adversaries, fierce opponents of Russia. So in short, I do welcome Mr. Johnson's visit. There may be an improvement in trade and in investment, but apart from that, nothing else whatsoever.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Nikolai, well, as you heard from your British colleagues, you heard that Marcus is quite skeptical about the improvements of political relations between Britain and Russia. And he was right saying that relations between Russia and the West are formed in Washington, not in the capitals of all the European countries, in London in particular. But from your point of view, are there any points of intersection between London and Moscow, for instance, fight against terrorism? Is there a possibility to agree at least on these points? Thank you very much, Oksana, and I greet my colleagues in London. It's always very welcoming to see them in this informal atmosphere and to discuss the sore points of relations between Great Britain and Russia and the processes that are underway in the whole world. I will start with referring to that article that was published in Sunday Times where Boris Johnson, just on the eve of his visit to Moscow, which is scheduled for Thursday, and we do hope that he will arrive to Moscow and will speak with his counterpart Sergei, although there were two previous cases when this visit was cancelled or postponed, but we do hope that this time it will take place. So just on the eve of his visit to Moscow, to give such assessments to Russia, on Russia, and assessment of and points of view on general international affairs in such a negative clue is not acceptable for a diplomat of such a level. What is he to expect here in Moscow? What welcome would he receive here after such a statement made just a couple of days before that visit, when he accuses Moscow of the gravest sins? Well, he wrote that maybe it's the laurels of Winston Churchill does not leave him, and he would like to be as high profile as Mr. Churchill, and he said that he would like to come to Moscow to as a Churchill with his baggage to show the proper place for Russia. But I don't remember that Sir Churchill showed the proper place to Stalin. They formed coalition, this anti-Hitler coalition between the United States, Great Britain and the USSR was very efficient, and the USSR praised high the contribution made by the USA and Great Britain into that coalition and opening the second front, and the contribution in the victory over the Nazi Germany. Well, Churchill in Russia is contradictory figure in British politics, but with a positive mark. The Fulton speech, where he outlined the future of the Cold War, and virtually that was something that triggered that iron curtain between the Western Europe and the Soviet Union. But we remember Sir Churchill by his decisiveness to fight together, shoulder to shoulder with the Soviet Union against the Nazi Germany. But Mr. Johnson, who wants to compare himself with who wants to be like Mr. Churchill, hasn't achieved anything. He hasn't proposed anything. So he is in the office, but during those few years that he is in the office, the Great Britain has experienced more failures than success stories. I speak not only about Brexit, that is gaining momentum now, and quite recently in Brussels, decision was taken to get to the second stage stage of Britain's withdrawal from the EU, but Britain's position there seems not that bright. What else can we say about the foreign policy? Fight against terrorism, that's true. That's an important task for all civilized nations to get together to combat terrorism, to do this work together, to suppress their aspirations not only in Syria but in other parts of the world. But what do we read in the British press? And this is quite often supported by British officials. Just recently, actually yesterday, I read in BBC materials. Do you remember about the acts of terror that 4 instances, if my memory doesn't fail me, happened in Great Britain last year, and we expressed our official condolences. And now it happens that it was Russia who inspired those acts of terror or gained some joy in that. And there were some Twitter attack from some certain Russian accounts, or maybe not Russian, but according to British special services, they were allegedly Russian cyber attacks. So we do not see any platform that can unite us, that can bring us together. Russia showed no sign of joy in the acts of terror that affected British population. Well, the whole comment of this sort is unthinkable, is something that cannot fit into any norms. So this background that was created for this meeting between Great Britain and Russia is very negative. So nothing about the two statements by Prime Minister May. Again, here in Russia, we are quite perplexed with that, bewildered with such statements. It seems that as of lately, nothing gloomed our relations. Well, the relationship between our two countries is at a very low level. That's something that we stated at our previous discussions, and that's true. And the trade turnover went down, and economic cooperation decreased nearly by 70%. But there were no aggravating circumstances to our interaction. But all of a sudden, Theresa May made such a harsh statement against Russia, as if Russia is trying to attack the democratic structures of Great Britain, some alleged interference in British life, and as if allegedly Russia tried to interfere in the Brexit votes or the latest parliamentary elections, as if allegedly Russia tried to interfere in all that. That's the background for such a such a high-ranking level, not just talk show on BBC or where Russia may be condemned of all mortal sins. But these are the statements of leaders of the country, foreign secretary and prime minister. If they speak so negatively about Russia in the darkest color, I cannot imagine any other person in Europe, be that from Brussels or Berlin or Paris, they criticize Russia, but they're not that harsh. I cannot remember any other such a statement from Juncker or Macron or Merkel. Maybe, as it was said in London, Britain is guided more by the position of the United States. Well, thank you, Oksana, for prompting that. Russia and China rank first on the list of threats to the United States. And well, my colleagues in London also spoke about that. And Marcus said that Britain's politics is formed in in Washington. But then why Donald Trump has not arrived yet to London to negotiate with his closest allies? As far as I remember, this visit was postponed for a number of cases. Although with the seeming warm relations between the USA and Great Britain, things are not that bright. In spring, Theresa May said that when Donald Trump makes a statement that do not agree with the line of European civilized nations, and quite recently we remember that the situation on Jerusalem was voted in the Security Council, and 14 countries, including the Great Britain, voted against that proposal, and spoke about recognition of two Jerusalems, the Eastern and Western. So that's a contradiction. It was the only delegation from the United States that vetoed that decision. They didn't listen to Paris or London or Moscow or Beijing. They didn't want to listen to anyone. That means that relations between London and Washington are not that smooth as they may seem. Well, just a couple of days ago, Donald Trump suggested a new concept of strategic national security. He spoke about two adversaries. There used to be just one, Russia, together with Iran and Korea. So we were the rogue states. Now we are joined by China, by Beijing. And so these are the two global rivals to the United States. And why Donald Trump stopped negotiations on TTIP, on transatlantic partnership? Well, Nikolai, I think that we may divert very far away from our main topic. Well, I would like to say that I do not quite agree with my colleagues in London that British politics is formed in Washington now, but we see that the American politics, not only towards Russia, but well, which is clear sanctions that should become more stringent. But I cannot understand how Donald Trump is going to improve and deepen their relations with the European Union and with London in particular. If my colleagues in London explain that, I would be very grateful to them. So what is a foreign policy of Great Britain now? Since Great Britain is experiencing difficult challenging times associated with Brexit, this may change its priorities to some extent. So, Elizabeth, I would like to hear from you your comment, and then a comment from Marcus on that.
Of course, and thank you very much for your input. I wouldn't take what Boris Johnson says seriously at all. We certainly don't take him seriously in this country. We see him as a public clown, a bit of a buffoon, a light-hearted chap, what we would call an Evelyn Waugh fop. No one takes him seriously. When he comes out with these outbursts, no one takes him seriously. Now, if you wanted to take the wind out of his sails, when he arrives in Moscow, if he does not please you, then perhaps you should cancel his flight back and tell him he's got to run the marathon back to Mrs. May and apologise yet again for fluffing it up. So I would run with the ancient Greek symbolism there. Furthermore, Sparta won. So, you know, congratulations to Russia. He sees you on the winning side of that battle. So please don't take him seriously. And let us not forget that Boris is not a blank sheet. He does have familial ties to Turkey. And of course, there have been difficulties in the past between Russia and Turkey. And it could well be that unconsciously, this is in the back of his mind, blocking progress. Similarly, with Theresa May and her speech stating that we know what Russia's doing. Well, does she? I should be very surprised if she did. I would not take these comments seriously at all. We are aghast in the United Kingdom that anyone's taking Twitter as seriously as they seem to be, and seem to be thinking that Twitter can actually be used as a propagandist tool. I'm sure that the people, the decent, ordinary working class people of Sunderland, which is the northern city of this country, which was the very first country to declare for Brexit, certainly did not have a phone call from Vladimir Putin or a tweet from the Kremlin telling them to vote out. They voted out of their own accord, and this is an absolute nonsense, and it's got to end. Brexit was not influenced by Russia in any way, shape or form. I know, I was on the streets canvassing, I spoke to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people about this issue face to face, and there was a commonality with regard to why they voted leave, and it certainly wasn't anything to do with the Kremlin. With regard to foreign policy, we are in a somewhat unusual situation now because we haven't quite freed ourselves from the EU. However, the United Kingdom has been around a lot longer than the EU. Indeed, the United Kingdom has been around a lot longer than America, and we are an old fox on the foreign policy front, and I am very confident that Anglo-Russian relations will improve. Let us not forget that there is a very significant population of Russians now in the United Kingdom, and British people, Russian people are making friends, they're marrying, they're having children, they're entering into trade deals, and behind the scenes, behind the politicians' bluster, there's a lot of very, very good work that's being done in order to assist trade and peace. Indeed, this year we've had the London Russian Film Festival. We've just had the Sochi Film Festival, which again was an Anglo-Russian affair. So these things are knitting up the ravel sleeve of care, and we will assuredly have much better relations and a better trading platform to move forward to in the future. So I'm very confident. I don't know if Boris Johnson will achieve much this time round. I know third time lucky. I think it's his third attempt to get to Russia. I cannot say that he will achieve much. I see it more as a symbolic move, but of course he's very, very keen to come to Moscow, and that is a very positive sign. So please, please don't take seriously what any of our politicians say publicly. It's what is happening behind the scenes, the connections between the respective peoples of our nations. So I'm very, very positive, and I would not be too depressed about it.
Marcus, the floor is yours.
Can I clarify something? Now, Nikolai will be aware of this, and everyone in the audience in Moscow will be aware of this. During World War I and World War II, Britain and Russia were on the same side, not because they were friends, but because they had a common enemy. In World War I, the common enemy was Imperial Germany. In World War II, the common enemy was Nazi Germany. In regard to Winston Churchill, well, Winston Churchill was in many ways a maverick, but his attitude towards the Russian people is very, very well documented. He questioned whether the Russians are actually humans. He said the Russians, in his opinion, are lower than the orangutan. Now, if we're talking about the relationship between America and Britain at the moment, well, you know, of course there will be disagreements between the two. There is a disagreement over Jerusalem, but what happened this week at the United Nations Security Council really was very much choreographed. It really was token opposition from the British representation there. There was certainly no harsh words from the British ambassador to the United Nations, or from Theresa May, or indeed from Boris Johnson regarding Donald Trump's Jerusalem decision. The fundamentals in the relationship between Britain and America are absolutely entrenched. And it really doesn't matter who's in the White House. It really doesn't matter who's in Downing Street. All that matters is that the systems in both countries are absolutely firmly placed. The foundation is unbreakable. And what are the fundamentals? The fundamentals are about ensuring that America, along with its vassal state, Britain, ensure Western global supremacy, and that any country in the world which poses a threat to that order, for example, Russia and also China, but in particular Russia, must be taken care of. That country must be demonized. That country must be put out on the periphery. Now, why why is the relationship at the moment between Britain and Russia so very, very bad? Well, as I said, any historian on relations between Britain and America will say the same. This is not unprecedented. Both countries have never liked each other, and both countries will never like each other. The mindsets are completely different. But during the 1990s, relations between Britain and Russia were much better, though of course the elites still harboured a disliking of each other. They still harboured a suspicion. But no doubt about it, the relationship was better. But why? Why did John Major and Tony Blair have a better relationship with Russia? Well, number one, because Russia in the 1990s was decimated. Russia was on its knees politically, economically, and militarily speaking. Russia could not oppose the criminal, murderous, and reckless decisions of Britain and along with America during the 1990s. There was nothing that Russia could do. So what the Americans and the British did in the former Yugoslavia, abhorrent that it was to Moscow, there was nothing the Russians could do. Also, in the Kremlin, you had Boris Yeltsin, arguably, in my opinion, the most appalling leader that Russia has ever had, far, far worse than Nicholas II. Nicholas II, for all of his failings, he was not a traitor. He was weak, he was indecisive, but he was not a traitor. But Boris Yeltsin was a traitor, and that is why the vast majority of Russian people absolutely hate him. He gave the British and the Americans everything that they wanted. He absolutely wrecked Russia. He destroyed the Russian society, and Russia was on its knees. The Americans and the British were happy for him to be there because they knew that Russia under him would remain a weak state, incapable of challenging the Americans and the British on the international scene. Now, as soon as Vladimir Putin came in, the British knew they were dealing with a very, very different Russian leader, a typical Russian leader, a very authoritarian leader, a very strong leader, which is of course is what the Russian people want and is what Russia requires. So Russia today in 2017 is a very resurgent country on the international stage. It has clawed back a lot of its lost superpower status. It certainly has a lot of challenges at home. For example, the need to diversify its economy. For example, the disparity between rich and poor. But Russia is resurgent, and the British and the Americans are fuming. They are bitter at what Russia has achieved in Syria. The Russians have prevented the British and the Americans from achieving their objective of trying to overthrow the Syrian government with the use of Islamist Wahhabist terrorists and to impose a pro-Western regime in Damascus. If we talk about Brexit, Russia had nothing to do with the decision of the British people to leave the European Union. Nothing whatsoever. I don't like the European Union, but for very different reasons to the Brexit camp in Britain. I don't like the European Union for ideological reasons and foreign policy reasons. But the British people chose to leave the EU because they are concerned about the loss of jobs, in particular in the working class parts of the country, in Northern England, the loss of jobs to people coming from the EU. I think also as well they're concerned about the transparency of the European Union. So Russia had nothing to do with it. But isn't it ironic that you have the British and the Americans accusing Russia of interfering in their internal affairs? Well, excuse me, Britain and America are the biggest violators of international law in the world. They are the biggest violators of the United Nations Charter in the world, and they have the audacity to accuse another country of interfering in their affairs. During the 1996 presidential election in Russia, the Americans dispatched some of their top PR experts to Moscow to ensure that Boris Yeltsin was re-elected as president, defeating the communist leader, Gennady Zyuganov. Now, we know that unofficially the communist candidate actually won that election, but the Americans were quite open about it. So I think it really is distasteful and audacious and ironical for the British now to be saying that Russia interfered during the Brexit referendum. No, they didn't. The British people took a decision. And also as well, there are many problems in Britain. There are many, many failings. The British economic system, indeed, the economic system in the West is failing. It's a very harsh system, and instead of the British government, instead of British mainstream media taking account of those failings and having an open and frank and intelligent discussion, what do to try and deflect attention from this repugnant system in Britain, this repugnant economic system in Britain? They blame Russia. Well, you know, that is simply untenable. That is simply unintelligent, and any enlightened, level-headed person understands what the British are doing at the moment.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. So it looks like Russia and Britain will have never been close allies, and we know that from history, and were brought together only by common threats, like we had in the First World War and Second World War, similarly. But out of what Marcus said, the challenge, the difficulty between our relations is that Russia has become a strong state. Had Russia been a weak state, then there will be no problem in relationships. So it seems that all our wishes to bring together our strength in the face of the common foe, which is terrorism, will fail. Well, that's a paradox that we live in. Well, Nicholas, what your comment on that? Well, Marcus's comment sounded very gloomy for me. Well, I think that before we get to fight with terrorism, I would like to comment on what was said. But what caught your eye? Well, what Marcus said is an opinion of several experts that I heard. I wouldn't quite agree with that about what he said about the times of Boris Yeltsin. Let us not discuss those times, because we're here to discuss more the modern times. Well, but I think that Marcus was right saying that over the centuries there was no big friendship between Imperial Russia or Soviet Union or Democratic Russia and Great Britain. And that could be explained by by the fact that several centuries ago, Great Britain claimed a supremacy globally. In the sea, we remember colonial voyages, expeditions of Great Britain to Africa, not only there, and then Great Britain was the supreme power in the world and brought together all many countries. Well, I don't want us to drift into history. Knowledge of history is very important, but what about today? Getting back to Brexit, we are here and we have many experts believing that Brexit will weaken Great Britain, because that will generate many challenges, many problems. For instance, with the unity of the state. Let us not forget about Scotland and Ireland. Well, I spoke about that more than once, and I will reiterate. I believe that that's a big mistake for London, for Great Britain to withdraw from the European Union. There are problems, and not all decisions that are taken in Brussels meet the interests of Great Britain. But there are 28 states nations in European Union, and it's not possible to take a decision that will would make all nations 100% happy, but I think that they agreed to come together to meet somewhere at midterms, somewhere and some golden mean. But it's on the other hand, it's quite all right for a country to live on its own. And there are many European countries, for instance Switzerland or Norway, that are doing fine without being in European Union. These are countries comparable by the wealth with Great Britain. There are poorer countries in Europe that want to join European Union to get access to this golden pie. We know that Europe, Serbia, Montenegro, and virtually all Balkan countries and Turkey still has not withdrawn its application to the EU. So that will well, the withdrawal will weaken British position in Europe and globally. But speaking about sanctions, we forecasted that during the Brussels EU summit, a decision was taken to prolong sanctions, and that was done. Well, that was something that we had forecasted. That was not something of a surprise to us, but the mechanism of extending sanctions was interesting for us. I will disclose some information because I work on the European Union. So the decision on sanction extension was taken exclusively on the negotiations between Paris and Berlin. We remember that London was very active. We remember that London had its strong say previously, but this time it was exclusively the opinion from Berlin and Paris. Some even East European countries, Slovakia and Czech, said that sanctions are not positive. They have a negative bilateral effect. Definitely, they affect negatively Russia's economy, but they affect negatively European European economy as well. Russia's economy ranks 12th in the world. It has over 140 million people, and many European countries want to cooperate with us to earn money, to gain profit, because that's the locomotive, the engine of progress. And mutually beneficial cooperation is something that does that. But now, when London virtually is excluded from this triangle, and many experts say that Italy, Rome will take, together with Madrid, maybe, will take London's place. So Paris, Berlin, Rome, but for the time being, Italy is very far away from the positions that Great Britain used to take in Europe. Although Britain didn't participate in negotiating sanctions, the discussion on sanctions in Russia, but still Great Britain is part of that. Well, but British sanctions on Russia is minuscule. It's similar to Malta imposing sanctions on Russia. We would say, well, that's really bad that Malta imposed its sanctions on Russia, but that will not affect Russia's economy. Well, British impact on us is more. I don't want to speak badly about Malta, but speaking about in the terms of economy, British effect on us is less than a mosquito bite. We need good relations with France and Germany because these are the main consumers of our gas and oil and consumers of the oil and gas sector. So for us, that is something that is very important. But in Berlin and in Paris, we see that these things are put aside. Nord Stream 2 is still under discussion. Some Nordic countries say that that will present the threat that will bypass the southern countries. For instance, Poland, and Poland will have to buy gas in Poland, and although now it buys gas from us and sells it to Germany. That explains Polish negative stand about Nord 2. Well, I understand, Nikolai, that you want to embrace the unbraceable, but we're here to discuss Russian-British relationship. But, well, what I had in mind is the importance or the effect of withdrawal from the European Union. Germans say that sanctions is something good, but when they speak about profitability and German economic interests, using Nord 2, Merkel says, well, that's nothing to do with politics, that's purely an economic project. So German companies participate in that and invest, and they even criticized Trump, said that if sanctions affect negatively Nord 2 stream, we don't need this type of sanctions. So here we clearly understand that Paris and Berlin speak about sanctions, still remember about the economic interest, and London does not pursue this interest. But Boris Johnson and Theresa May just say that Russia is a bad state, or maybe because we have very weak economic relations. Well, if there were free will, Great Britain is the 5th economy of the world, and we're the 12th economy in the world. So we, about 100 billion turnover. That's what we had before sanctions. It's far below the turnover between Great Britain and the United States. But we are closer geographically than the United States, and we used to have our own economic contacts and contracts that were satisfactory to both sides. Why cut them? Why destroy that? I think that Britain is not very wise in this, and Marcus said that not all things are fine in Britain, but with all those negative things, failures in the British economy, they should be more considerate of relations, economic relations with Russia, and that will affect the economic economy in Britain and its image. So I would like to pick up the theme of Brexit with London. To my understanding, the experts that we have here today welcome withdrawal from the European Union, but I would like to ask you a bit different thing. Don't you think that Brexit will weaken Britain in certain respects? You said that it will give more jobs to people, will give more independence to Britain, and Britain will be able to pursue its own international policy without looking at Europe. But there are territorial issues that may be triggered by withdrawal, because Scotland wants to stay part of the European Union. There are Ireland and difficulties with the boundaries. Do you see that there may be some challenges with regards to these issues because of Brexit, although you're for withdrawal? Elizabeth.
Thank you for that query. Again, I do not have such a gloomy view as my two male guests here today. I'm very positive about Anglo-Russian relations. I'm very positive indeed. The United Kingdom Independence Party has been consistently opposed to sanctions as an economic punishment upon any country, because, of course, that ultimately bites us. When the Russian sanctions began, brought in by the EU, of course, the Scottish fisheries market suffered considerably, as Russia has been a significant purchaser of Scottish fishery goods. They were impacted badly. Similarly, Welsh dairy farmers were impacted badly. So it's not been without disappointment from the British economy. Now, we want to move forward and have very good trade relations with Russia. We have extensive Russian connection in London. Indeed, there is the Anglo-Russian Business Federation, Anglo-Russian business networks that are working all the time to improve such relations and build bridges, and it has been successful. We do have a trade deficit. In fact, Russia benefits more from the United Kingdom than we do from Russia trade-wise. That's just a fact that Russia supplies us with oil and gas and raw materials for chemicals. We supply Russia with cars, agricultural equipment, art, school fees, banking, things of that ilk. And it is hoped that we will simply provide more and more of those goods and services, and that Russia and Britain will enter into an excellent mutually beneficial trade deal, which we think we can achieve once we're out of the EU and once we are not subject to the EU sanctions. I see it as an entirely positive matter. Now, with regard to Scotland, Scotland's already had a referendum concerning independence, and even Nicola Sturgeon, leader of the SNP, Scottish Nationalist Party, has said that she is not seeking to push that agenda any further. It is now very, very unpopular. Scotland will remain as part of the United Kingdom. Scotland is not going off into the sunset to become a separate vassal state of the EU. With regard to Ireland, that has been a long-standing drama with the United Kingdom. It has been before we ever entered the EU, before the EU ever existed. There were issues with regard to the border, and we will proceed with a soft border similar to the Mexican-American border. I can't see that being a difficulty whatsoever. These are merely confections and artificialities just to cause friction with the Brexit process. Brexit must be allowed to go ahead. I know that my Russian colleague was of the view that Britain was better staying off in the EU. I simply don't agree with that at all. There has been a national vote, and the British people voted out, and that will happen, and that will produce significant economic results. We'll be free to trade as we did formerly in the past with our Commonwealth partners. So I see it as very, very positive. Thank you.
Marcus, пожалуйста, ваш...
Marcus, your comment, please.
Yes, excuse me. Yes, I think it's delusional for anyone to argue that once Britain leaves the EU, which it will, then there will be better relations between Britain and Russia. I have never heard that argument before. It is very, very peculiar. I think that demonstrates a complete ignorance of the history of relations between Britain and Russia, that is completely ignorant of the absolute hostility and mutual distrust between the British establishment and the Russian establishment. Conversely, once Britain leaves the EU, there may be, and I emphasise, there just may be an opportunity for relations between the EU and Russia to improve. And I have to issue a caveat, just maybe. Who was the driving force back in 2014 for the EU to place sanctions on Russia? Well, it wasn't Germany, it wasn't France, it wasn't Italy, it wasn't Spain, it was Britain. It was Britain who was the driving force for the sanctions on Russia. And Britain, once again, was doing the lobbying, doing the bidding on behalf of the Americans. And once Britain leaves the European Union, it will simply impose its own sanctions on Russia. I mean, that's common knowledge in Whitehall and in Westminster. Now, in regard to a slight improvement between Brussels and Moscow, well, that could come about because it's very well known that Britain has long been the eyes and ears of America in the European Union. Indeed, I refer to Britain's membership of the European Union as being a Trojan horse for the Americans, and the French and the Germans are very cautious just exactly what they say to their British counterparts, because they know it gets relayed back to Washington. But having said that, even though there's a possibility for an improvement between the EU and Russia only once Britain leaves, we have to remember that the Americans have a very strong hold over the European Union, in particular over Germany. Now, there are so many reasons as to why Britain will maintain a hostile stance towards Russia. Yes, there might be an opportunity to improve trade and investment. I mean, sure, even during the most bitter times during the Cold War, the Soviet Union and Britain traded with each other. I mean, you don't have to like someone to do business with someone, but Britain will be free to do as it pleases when it comes to Russia, and it will forge an even closer special relationship with America. Indeed, conservative politicians in Britain, conservative commentators, conservative journalists are saying that once Britain is out of the EU, Britain will be free to pursue relations with its true friends in the world. And who are those true friends, according to these people? The Anglo-Saxon countries in the world. That is another indication of why relations between London and Moscow will not improve. And it also highlights another reason as to why Britain has this hostility towards Russia, because the British establishment have this sense of Anglo-Saxon superiority, and they regard countries like America, Canada, Australia and New Zealand as brothers, as kindred spirits, and they regard Russia as this almost like demon country in the world, this barbaric country that threatens civilization, that threatens freedom, that threatens democracy. And my last point is this in regard to UKIP, and I say this as not liking the European Union, but at the same time I don't like the Brexit camp and I don't like the Remain camp. But in regard to UKIP are a fiercely pro-American party. They are an Atlanticist party. Just look at the behaviour of its former leader, Mr. Farage, Nigel Farage, how he's constantly in America. Now, UKIP was taking a different approach to Russia over the crisis in Ukraine, not for any love of Russia, but simply to use Russia as a tool against the European Union. UKIP is a fervently pro-American party, and it fervently supports the special relationship. And as my colleagues, my comrades in Moscow know, that special relationship has brought carnage to the world, and that special relationship will become even stronger, even more special once Britain leaves the European Union.
Благодарю, Маркус.
Thank you, Marcus, and I would like to to include our colleagues journalists into this. Well, you mentioned Nigel Farage in your comment. He is the political figure that speaks against the European Union and the United States. But about 3 weeks ago, I watched his interview on one of the British channels, and the journalist asked him, "Mr. Farage, you spoke for withdrawal from the European Union, so the decision was taken. So you will get his British representative in the European Parliament. So you will have a retirement pension. Will it be right for you to receive this pension? Because it would be right to say no to that." Well, he said, "Well, why should I say no to this pension?" Well, sort of double standards. Well, that was something that surprised me. Where are your principles, Mr. Forden? But I agree with Marcus in principle that the foundation what lays the foundation for our relationship is the Anglo-Saxon platform, and we see that clearly over the past decades. But I would like to conclude in the positive, in something positive. I agree with Elizabeth about the relations between Russia and Great Britain. Although there are some disagreements on political issues, but we are civilized nations, and the mentality of Russians and British is different, but in the English language, and the British Weltanschauung is very welcomed here in Russia, and 80% of Russian school children study English. And just on the eve of the World Cup, we have even more attention to Great Britain, because the British football team will come here to Russia, and we're very happy to welcome them here. Just in Britain, quite recently, I read a number of articles that there may be some aggression here, or some accidents or incidents with British fans. It looks like a threatening campaign being launched against British fans, so that they do not come to Russia. That's rubbish. Well, we welcome them. We are looking forward to World Cup. We want it to be at the highest possible level. We will welcome British athletes and British fans. Russians are not very good in foreign languages, but it is at least the English language that everyone speaks, nearly everyone speaks. So that is the positive comments that I would like to add in conclusion. So maybe Boris Johnson, when he finally arrives here and meets his friend Sergei, he will understand finally through this direct contact. I hope that our Ministry of Foreign Affairs will be able to exert positive effect on Boris Johnson. He will not awake with the thoughts about ancient Sparta, what Russia is preparing for the whole world. Thank you, Nikolai. And I turn now to our colleagues in our Moscow studio. You are welcome to ask questions to our experts here in Moscow and in London. Good afternoon. I'm Anastasia Sedelnikova from Sputnik TV. I will ask the question in English. The question is addressed to
for Elizabeth. In the first place, thank you so much for your input and for your expertise. And I've got two questions for you, if you permit. So the first one would be, you called the upcoming visit of Boris Johnson symbolic. So do I understand you correctly that with the current officials, we're somewhat in a limbo, that you don't expect any progress to be done while the officials are the same? So while Theresa May is in power, while Boris Johnson is the top official, so you don't expect that we can make progress. So that's the first one. And the second one is about the visit as well. So I know it's hard to predict what topics will be discussed during the visit, but what you would like as a lawmaker as well, Boris Johnson, to bring up during his visit, to what topics, what improvements, and what arguments. So yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.
It's lovely to have those questions. Now, with regard to my comment about Boris Johnson's up-and-coming meeting being symbolic, well, unfortunately, we are somewhat in limbo in the United Kingdom, because we're sort of half in, half out of the EU. So all we can do at this stage, I would say, would be to germinate. We just want to plant the seeds of friendship and trade, because it's all about trade, trade, and trade. The most important steps forward that Boris can make is to open the door to trade and direct inward foreign investment, us in Russia, you in the UK. This is what it's all about, making both our countries richer and ensuring we continue to have the flow of intellectual ideas, the flow of creativity and culture between our countries. As I said earlier, as I'm sure you're aware, there's a very large Russian population in London now. And of course, this has been very fruitful for us. Friendships have been made, marriages, children have been born, businesses have been begun, and of course we're getting to know each other at a much, much deeper level than ever before, and I think this will be very fruitful for the future. At the moment, all we can do is germinate the seeds, because we're still not in the clear yet, we're still not free of the EU, and it is hoped that those seeds will germinate, and perhaps a year down the line, a couple of years down the line, will result in a very fruitful harvest for both countries. Now, what issues I'd like Boris to bring up? Well, I'm sure Boris has his own rota of issues that are private between him and his advisors. We're not clearly privy to that, but I would hope the emphasis would be on trade. The emphasis has to be on trade and, of course, very importantly, the exchange of information with regard to the prevention of terrorism. And I'm sure we all read recently the exchange that took place between Donald Trump and Russia concerning the St. Petersburg business. So it's all about trade, it's all about safety and friendship. And I hope that something can be achieved, but I really don't think at this stage much can be achieved until we are free of the EU. But fingers crossed, and I hope that perhaps Boris's bluster and comedy will at the very least entertain you all. I don't think there's much further I can add.
Спасибо.
Thank you. So, microphone goes to the first row. Please introduce yourself and your question. Good afternoon. My name is Dmitry Nersesev. I'm from the internet media Pravda, or the Truth Room. My question is to our British experts. You said that relationship between EU and the US is fundamental for London, and that's quite natural and again organic. And conclusions can be made that Brexit was also an Anglo-Saxon project, Anglo-American idea, concept. And can we say that London is becoming a new pole of strength in that Anglo-American project? And what will be the policy of that pole of strength in 10, 15, 20 years' time with regards to the European Union, for instance? Can we say that London will encourage regionalism and Euroscepticism in European Union, for instance, in Austria, in Spain, in the Baltic states, in the Balkan states? And Elizabeth, you said that trade, and trade. But what about nuclear weapons? Great Britain is a member of NATO, and nuclear disarmament steps in the foreground. Can you forecast the perspective in this? Plans for that? Marcus? Okay. The floor is yours.
Well, I think my colleague in Moscow makes a very, very interesting observation about how Brexit could be defined as an Anglo-Saxon project. I wouldn't subscribe to that theory entirely, but there's no question about it that, in my opinion, at the core of Brexit is this sense of Anglo-Saxon superiority, is this sense that we don't want to be told what to do by French people and German people and so-called lazy people in the Mediterranean. We want to be with our true friends in the world, our kindred spirits in the world, the Anglo-Saxon countries. And whilst I don't believe there should be a second referendum on Brexit, you know, I don't agree with referendums in the first place, but, you know, last year the British people voted to leave, and that will be it, and Britain will leave the European Union. But I don't believe that the British economy will collapse post-Brexit. I believe the British economy will remain one of the most powerful in the world. Will it lose a lot? Possibly. You know, certainly diplomats from China and India and Japan that I've spoken to are very, very concerned because they see Britain as a bridge to re-export their goods from Britain to the European mainland without paying tariffs. But only time will tell. But I do believe that once Britain is out of the European Union, Britain will place its own sanctions on Russia, and it will be free to pursue an even more hostile stance towards Russia. Nikolai spoke about the World Cup next year. My dear friend Nikolai, we both know that is absolutely meaningless. We heard the same talk leading up to the Sochi Winter Olympics, that this is an opportunity for relations to improve between Britain and Russia and America. Well, of course, that never happened, and it was never going to happen. The establishments in Britain and in America simply do not care about sporting events. What they do care about is ensuring ensuring Western global supremacy. And my final observation is this: please, too much attachment is being made to Boris Johnson. Yes, he's an imbecile. Yes, he's an embarrassment. Yes, he's like a little boy talking to Sergei Lavrov. Sergei Lavrov is a seasoned diplomat. He's a formidable diplomat. I think he's arguably one of the greatest Russian foreign ministers in history. But it doesn't matter who's foreign secretary. It doesn't matter who's prime minister. What matters is that the system is entrenched and that the establishment, and I truly mean the British establishment, not the establishment that UKIP talk about, I talk about the real British establishment, that their hold on power in Whitehall and Westminster is absolutely supreme. Before Boris Johnson, we had Philip Hammond. It was exactly the same, although Philip Hammond was more professional. Before Philip Hammond, we had William Hague, though it was more professional. It's the policy that remains entrenched. It's the mindset that remains entrenched. So, yes, I would like Boris Johnson to talk about trying to improve trade between Russia and America, Russia and Britain, and investments, mutual investment between the two countries. But that will be it. Let us not forget, Britain is calling for a further NATO presence on Russia's borders. Britain is calling Russia a criminal player, is calling Russia a child killer in regard to the Russian military campaign in Syria. These are just two examples of just how ferociously hostile Britain is towards Russia. That has always been the case over hundreds of years. It's not going to change. It doesn't matter who's in the Foreign Office. It doesn't matter who's in Downing Street. It's the mindset, and it's the establishment, and it is the system. That's all that matters.
If I could just return, If I could just return to that point with the Pravda gentleman, thank you very much for your question. With regard to nuclear disarmament, yes, in an ideal world, of course, no country in the world would have nuclear armaments, but unfortunately, whilst there are countries in the world with nuclear armaments, we need to present an equal, if not greater, threat to ensure world peace. And to ensure, what is world peace all about? Well, it's to ensure that trade can take place securely. So everything is about trade to ensure the current standard of living that we enjoy, and we hope to improve on that standard of living and expand that standard of living to as many people as possible in the world, and that can only be achieved by ensuring safe trade routes. So unfortunately at this where we are at the moment, it is a necessity, and I anticipate that the United Kingdom will continue to maintain Trident and will continue to maintain a nuclear deterrent. But it is, I am very, very confident that once we are free of the EU, we will be free to enjoy a warmer relationship with Russia. There's absolutely no reason why we should not do so. We have a great deal in common. We enjoy a great deal of cultural activity. We hold your culture in very, very high regard. Indeed, Dmitry Horotovsky recently died in the United Kingdom, one of Russia's greatest opera singers of all time, and he was considered to be a national idol in the United Kingdom. So we do not have any hostile feelings toward Russia in any way, shape or form. Now, how our politicians may express themselves in public is one thing. How they behave in private, of course, is a very different matter indeed. As I said earlier, Britain is an old fox in the foreign policy world. We've been around a hell of a lot longer than America and the EU, and I anticipate we will be around a lot longer than the EU. So I'm very, very positive about things moving forward. I don't anticipate that things will happen in a great rush, in a hurry, but over the years I think that there will be a much better cooperation and openness between the nations. And also I do think that football is very, very important. Football is the lifeblood and joy of many, many men in the world, and the fact that Russia is hosting this year is a fantastic step forward. Now I appreciate there has been, whether Nikolai likes it or not, there has been some aggression between Russian ultras and British fans, namely in France, and I understand that. That is in fact a backhanded compliment to the young British football fans and hooligans of the 70s and 80s, so I understand we're the world leaders in football hooliganism, and Russia is seeking to emulate them. Well, I'm afraid our crown, we're happy to pass our crown to you, and we hope that we accept that your football fans are bigger and stronger than ours now and probably a bit more athletic, so we're happy to hand over that crown to you, and we ask that both sides respect each other and that both sides really enjoy a good series of football matches.
May I make two very quick points? First of all, the most important thing in the world is not trade. The most important thing in the world is international law and adherence to international law, something that is not in the vocabulary of Britain and America. As I said earlier, Britain and America are the leading violators of international law and of the United Nations Charter. That is indisputable, especially over the last 25 years. The second point is that my colleague is almost implying that the reason why Britain has a hostile stance towards the Russian Federation is because of the EU. Well, that is absolutely nonsensical. Britain has a long history of antagonism towards Russia. It has nothing to do with the EU. One piece of evidence to substantiate that is who put the pressure on the EU to impose sanctions on Russia. It was Britain, and everyone knows in Whitehall and Westminster that once Britain is out of the EU, it will simply place its own sanctions on Russia.
Thank you very much, Marcus. And I would like to assure Elizabeth, on behalf of all Russians, that Russian fans will be the most hospitable and welcoming to all fans coming to Russia, and will not be the first to trigger, to give spark to any incidents. One of the Russian journalists spoke about Brexit as an Anglo-American, Anglo-Saxon project, and Marcus more than once said that Britain being a part of the European Union or stepping out of that will never lift its sanctions that were once imposed on Russia. But in February next year, 2018, the United States will impose even stricter sanctions against Russia. At least that's their plan, and there is a small probability that the European Union will not support that, but it looks like Great Britain will support that. Are there any chances for improvement of relationship? But all our dialogue boils down to one very small but very unpleasant conclusion, that it looks like it's very difficult to improve our relations, next to impossible. Thank you very much, Oksana and Marcus and Elizabeth. I will comment on the first part of the question that was raised by our journalists about Brexit being an American or Anglo-American project. I don't agree with that. I would, because Obama and then Trump said in a very diplomatic way that they would like to see Great Britain part of the European Union, because it was easier for them to have their impact on the European Union when they had a good fraternal ally in the European Union. That was their main channel of exerting influence on Brussels. But now Great Britain steps out, withdraws, and thus the United States lose this channel. So this Brexit is not in the interests of the United States. So now we see that instead of Great Britain, which was the tool of instrument, Poland Warsaw tries to take that place. All its latest moves in NATO in particular, they spoke about the building up of a threat from the east, and they need there is need to enhance NATO presence on the eastern boundaries, and it's rhetorics about migration and Ukraine, and we haven't mentioned that today. But here we speak about, remember, Britain. Britain is outside the Minsk format. If we take the Minsk process, Berlin and Paris were part of that, but Britain was not part of it. Well, it's better. I wish we didn't have the conflict in Ukraine. Well, yes, that's true. But who was behind Maidan events in Kiev, and whose intelligence? Who was not there? But it's clear that Britain had a hand in that, especially the ambassador of Great Britain. There was financing going to. Channeling to support financially some gangs in Ukraine. So virtually they had a coup d'etat there because the constitution was brushed aside. So getting back to the question about some ways to improve our relations. I would stay pessimistic and agree with Marcus. I see that Elizabeth is as an optimist and thinks in the right clue, but let us be also a realist. Unfortunately, to my great regret, London, not even Paris or London or Paris or Berlin, but it is London who will oppose Moscow on many fronts. And the trends that prevail in Great Britain. We see that in Theresa May anti-Russian statements and those comments about Sparta and not Sparta made by Boris Johnson. It means that British establishment is cast in its old mentality of the 18th or 19th century. Although we saw some positive shifts in relations, and I would speak about two stages. That was during Margaret Thatcher's times, when she found some common ground for conversation with Michael Gorbachev, and later a Labourist Party representative, the family, his name skipped my memory. That was again at the time when there were some. It was felt some new wind in the sails, some positive wind in our sails. But that was very temporary episodes of our history, and we got to political confrontation. Yes, alas, I don't see any ways to improve Russian-British relationship. And for Russia, sanctions, British sanctions and British stand is unpleasant, definitely, but not more than that. It doesn't affect very negatively Russian economic, political, or international stand. We used to act without Britain's support, and we will still do that. We will try to resolve the conflict in Ukraine within the NORMAD format without Britain. If Britain agrees to cooperate with us against international terrorism, we will welcome that. Just a couple of words on what Donald Trump had his conversation with Mr. Putin. American intelligence service helped us to prevent large-scale acts of terror in St. Petersburg. We are very grateful to them, but this means that even in spite of all those contradictions that exist between our two countries, we can cooperate on this ground of combating terrorism. So I cannot understand why such cooperation is not possible between London and Moscow. So, I would say that we should not hope for great improvements of relationship between our two countries. I'm not that optimistic about that, but let's still hope for the better. Thank you very much, Nikolai, and we will keep a close eye on the visit by Boris Johnson to Moscow, and we hope that there will be some common grounds found between Russia and Great Britain. We are to close our video bridge, and I would like to thank Marcus and Elizabeth for finding time in their schedule to speak with us, and I would like to thank Nikolai Topornin and our journalist. If you are in Moscow, welcome to us, and we hope to have another meeting soon. Thank you.